The tractor had about 3 hours of fuel left when Joe Harlan hit something that wasn't soil. He felt it before he heard it. A resistance in the bucket, the kind that meant rock or old concrete, something that didn't belong 18 inches under a Tennessee pasture. He'd been working the back 14 acres since 7 that morning, stripping the old fallow ground down to plow depth, and nothing in 6 hours had given him any trouble. The dirt was dark and dense from decades of rest, coming up clean and easy. Then the bucket stopped. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Joe killed the throttle. The deer rattled down to idle, and in the sudden quiet, he caught the sounds the engine had been drowning out. Whined through the old cedar fence posts. A crow working the far cornfield. His own breathing heavier now than it used to be. He climbed down from the cab. His knees had been giving him grief since March, and 6 hours of vibration hadn't helped any. He was 61 years old, and he moved like a man who'd spent 40 of those years doing the kind of work that doesn't forgive you when you get old. He walked around to the front of the bucket and looked at what the blade had turned up. Iron, or mostly iron, coated in the orange crust of rust that's soil and decades in water due to metal left in the ground. A corner of something sticking out maybe 4 inches from the raw face of earth where the bucket had cut through. Whatever it was substantial. Not a pipe, not a fence post. Something with angles. Something made. Joe stood there with his hands on his hips. The morning had burned off, and the afternoon sun was hitting the field at a low angle, catching the exposed metal and holding it dull orange. He got down on one knee and pressed his thumb against the rust. It gave slightly on the surface, but underneath the metal was solid. Old solid. The kind that comes from being made when things were built to last because they had to. He spent 20 minutes with a spade in his hands, clearing the dirt from around it. What came out of the ground was a chest. An iron chest, roughly the size of a large suitcase, with a flat lid and a padlocked hasp on the front. The padlock was a chunky, heavy-gauge thing, the kind you'd find on a barn door from another era. The lock itself was furred with rust, but when Joe grabbed the body of it and pulled, it held. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. His grandfather had told him never to work this field. His father had repeated that instruction with the same lack of explanation his father had given. That's where we buried the mule. Joe had believed it as a child. As a teenager, the mule's story had started to seem like what it was, an answer designed to stop question. But he'd never pushed further, and the field had stayed fallow for as long as he could remember, fenced off with old wire that nobody maintained because nobody needed to. Now there was an iron chest in the ground where the mule was supposed to be. 3 hours of fuel left in the tank, and a foreclosure hearing scheduled for the 14th of next month. Joe got up and went to get his bolt cutters. The Harlan farm sat on 212 acres in the hill country east of Woodbury, Tennessee, in a part of Cannon County where the roads went to gravel about 2 miles past the county line, and the neighbors were far enough apart that you could go a week without seeing another car in your driveway, unless you called them first. The land had been in Joe's family since 1943, when his grandfather Earl Harlan bought it, or bought what he claimed was it, from a man whose name had been erased from local memory with the same efficiency that certain families apply to things they'd rather not have written down anywhere. Earl was dead by the time Joe was born. Died in 1967, 4 years before Joe arrived, leaving behind a farm that was already producing well and a reputation in the county as a man who worked hard and kept to himself. Joe's father, Doyle, had inherited the land and the work ethic, but apparently not whatever else Earl had been carrying. Or if he'd inherited the secrets, he'd carried them to his grave the same way his own father had, without apparent effort, without visible strain. Joe had grown up knowing the farm the way you know your own skin. Every fence line, every slope, every wet corner that flooded in March and dried to cracked clay by July. He'd gone to Woodbury Central High School and spent exactly 1 semester at Middle Tennessee State before coming home when Doyle's back gave out and the farm needed someone to run it. He meant for that to be temporary. He was 20 years old and full of ideas about what his life was going to look like from the outside looking in. He met Ruth at a church social in the spring of his second year back. She was from Readyville, 1 county over, with her mother's practical eyes and her father's habit of laughing at something before she decided whether it was actually funny. They married in 1988, moved into the farmhouse where Joe had grown up, and made it theirs by degrees, painting rooms and replacing windows and putting their daughter Melissa's height marks on the kitchen doorframe every birthday until the doorframe ran out of room. Ruth had worked at the elementary school in Woodbury for 23 years, teaching 3rd grade. She was the kind of teacher whose former students came back to visit even after they had children of their own, the kind who remembered names without effort and made children feel that their questions were worth asking. She died in September 2 years ago, 14 months from the diagnosis to the end. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors explained the statistics at the beginning, and Joe had refused to believe them, which turned out to be the cruelest kind of hope available. He'd spent those 14 months certain that Ruth would be the exception, and when she wasn't, the gap she left was the shape of someone who'd been the organizing principle of everything. The medical bills had been the first wave. They'd believed the insurance would cover most of it, and it did, until it didn't. There were gaps between approvals and denials, between what the policy said in plain language, and what the actual payout came to. The specialist in Nashville who was out of network. The drug that required prior authorization and got it too late. The weeks of palliative care at the end that the policy classified differently than they expected. Joe had handled all of it himself, signing forms and making calls while Ruth was in the back bedroom listening to the radio in the mornings the way she always had, and he'd kept the numbers away from her because she had enough to carry. The second wave was the equipment loans, a new combine they'd financed in 2019 when crop prices were decent and the math seemed reasonable, and the line of credit they'd drawn on when the drought hit in 2021 and the soybean crop came in 40% below expectations. The third wave was just the arithmetic of all of it landing at once in the winter after Ruth was gone, when Joe finally spread all the papers across the kitchen table and looked at the full number. $340,000. First Consolidated Bank of Murfreesboro had been patient by their standards. They'd restructured twice. But restructuring is not forgiveness, and patience in banking is just a longer fuse on the same charge. Melissa had come back in February. Her marriage to Kevin had been unraveling for 2 years before it finally went, and she came home with her kids, Cody, who was 8, and Harper, who had just turned 5. She slept in her old room. The kids shared the room that had been Joe's office. Joe did not complain about losing the office because the alternative was Melissa living in a studio apartment in Murfreesboro on a receptionist salary with 2 children, and he'd raise her better than to allow that without a fight. What he hadn't told her was how close to gone the farm actually was. She knew it was bad. You couldn't live in a house with a man carrying that kind of weight and not feel it in the air. But the specific number, the date on the foreclosure notice, the exact shape of the problem, those he'd kept to himself. Partly because he didn't want to frighten her. Partly because saying it out loud would make it more real than he could afford for it to be while he was still looking for a way out. Clearing the backfield had been his idea from 3 weeks ago, when he'd been awake at 2 in the morning doing what sleeplessness does, which is to make every problem feel permanent. The back 14 acres had never produced because they'd never been worked. If he could break that ground, he might get a cover crop in before the first frost, then plant corn in the spring. It wouldn't solve the debt, not by itself. But it was something to do instead of sitting still, and Joe had learned over the past 2 years that sitting still was its own kind of danger. His father's voice had come back to him when he'd driven the first fence post out of the ground to open the field. That's where we buried the mule. He'd pushed it aside. Doyle had said a lot of things over the years that turn out to mean other things, and a man who lets every ghost stop him doesn't get any work done. Now he was standing over an iron chest in the dirt of that field, and the bolt cutters were in the toolbox on the back of the tractor, and his heart was moving faster than it should have been for a man who'd only been clearing ground. He retrieved the bolt cutters and came back to the chest, crouched beside it. The padlock hasp was rust-fused to the lid, and he had to work the jaws of the cutters into position with some effort. When he squeezed, the shackle gave on the third press, not dramatically, just a clean failure at the weakest point, the metal parting with a sound like a cold branch breaking. He set the lock aside on the ground. He stood looking at the lid for a moment longer than he'd have admitted if anyone had been watching. He should have called someone first. That thought came clearly. Called who to say what? He'd found something in his field, and it was his field, and whatever was in a chest buried in his field was something he needed to see before he started explaining it to anyone. He lifted the lid. It took some effort. The hinges had rusted to a point just short of seized, and the lid came up with a grinding reluctance that sent orange dust drifting into the afternoon air. Joe got it open to about 45 degrees before it held there, propped against its own resistance. The smell hit him first, old and mineral and dry, with something underneath that he couldn't immediately name. Not rot, not decay. Something older than that. Like the smell of a drawer in a very old house that hasn't been opened in your lifetime. A smell that belongs to objects that have existed without air for a long time. He looked inside. The first thing he registered was canvas. Heavy canvas, waxed or treated with something, folded into the bottom of the chest in a way that meant someone had wrapped things carefully before placing them. One large bundle on the left, heavy enough that the canvas had compressed under its own weight. A smaller bundle in the center, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, slick and dark with age. And beside that, a leather-bound book, its cover dark from years in the ground but structurally intact, held closed with a length of dried cord. Joe picked up the larger bundle first. Even through the canvas, he could feel the weight, more than the size suggested. He sat on the ground beside the chest and unwrapped it slowly. Coins. A pile of gold coins, maybe 60 or 70 of them, some stacked, some loose, all dull with the patina of old gold that's never seen polish. The topmost one caught the afternoon sunlight and held it warm and steady. Joe picked it up and turned it over. An eagle on one face, a liberty head on the other, with the date 1904 stamped below the portrait. He'd seen coins like this in photographs, not in a field in Cannon County. He set it down and picked up another. 1897, another. 1922, a fourth, 1938. The dates ranged across 40 years, the coins worn to varying degrees, some almost sharp and some rubbed smooth by handling. All gold, every one. His hands were not entirely steady. He reached for the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it on the ground beside the coins. Inside was a folded document of some kind, pressed flat and protected from moisture by the cloth. He set it aside without opening it. Beneath the document, wrapped separately in a smaller piece of the same oilcloth, was something he took for a collection of. Dried sticks at first, small and pale, arranged without apparent order, some linked, some loose. Then his brain caught up to what his eyes were already sending it. They were bones, small bones. Hand bones, he thought, from the shape of them. The small, specific bones of a human hand, too delicate and too precisely formed to be anything else, too small to be anything he could tell himself they were and believe it. Joe sat back on his heels in the turned dirt. His mind went through several things at once and in no clear order. The chest in the ground. His grandfather's insistence that no one ever work this field. The bones wrapped in oilcloth in a sealed chest that had been underground long enough for the padlock to rust solid. The gold coins running from 1897 to the late 1930s. The leather journal sitting in the chest with a cord around it. He reached into his shirt pocket for his phone. He dialed 911. The dispatcher was a woman with the brisk, practiced calm of someone who had handled every variety of rural emergency and reduced each one to a set of steps. She asked for his location, and he gave her the farm address and then the additional instructions for finding the backfield, because the farm address got you to the house, and the backfield was another quarter-mile from there on foot. "And what's the nature of the emergency, sir?" Joe looked at the bones and the oilcloth and the iron chest in the ground and the pile of old gold coins on the dirt. "I found human remains," he said, "in a chest, in my field." A pause of about 2 seconds. "Are you in any danger, sir?" "No." "Is there anyone else present at the location?" "No." "Stay on the line and don't touch anything further." "I'm dispatching now." He stayed on the line. He didn't touch anything further. He sat in the dirt of the back 14 acres with the afternoon sun moving west and the crow still working the far cornfield and the old deer idling behind him, and he waited. Sheriff Dana Pruitt arrived in 22 minutes, which was fast for this part of the county. She came in the county cruiser with a deputy named Watts in the passenger seat, a young man about 18 months on the job who still had the particular alertness of someone who hadn't yet learned which emergencies resolved into embarrassment and which ones didn't. Joe had turned off the tractor by then and was standing at the edge of the disturbed ground, away from the chest, the way the dispatcher had asked. When the cruiser pulled through the gate he'd left open, he raised a hand. Pruitt was 53, with the lean, weather-worn quality of someone who'd spent a long career doing physical work in all conditions. She'd been sheriff for 11 years, before that a Nashville detective for 12, before that a patrol officer who'd decided early that she wasn't going to let the work make her cynical and had mostly succeeded. She wore the county uniform with the ease of someone who'd forgotten it was a uniform. She got out of the cruiser and walked toward Joe without hurry. "Mr. Harlan." "Sheriff." She looked at the field, the disturbed dirt, the chest still propped open where he'd left it. "Show me." He led her over. She stopped 3 feet from the chest and pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves before she leaned in to examine the contents. Her face stayed neutral the way Joe's hadn't, moving from the coins to the oilcloth bundles to the leather journal, giving each one 10 or 12 seconds before she straightened. "You opened this?" "Yes, with bolt cutters. I didn't know what it was when I found it." "What did you think it was?" "I thought it might be old equipment, something a previous owner buried." He paused. "I opened it before I thought clearly about it." Pruitt looked at the destroyed padlock on the ground. "Okay." She turned to Watts. "Photograph everything as it sits. Don't touch anything until we have the full kit out here. And call the state forensic unit in Murfreesboro." She turned back to Joe. "How long has your family owned this property?" "Since 1943. My grandfather bought it. And this specific field, always been left alone. My grandfather told my father not to work it. My father told me the same. I'd never broken ground back here before today." Pruitt's expression held the particular neutral of someone processing information without displaying it. Was there a reason given for leaving it alone? "He said there was a mule buried here." "A mule?" "That's what he said." Pruitt looked at the chest. "That's not a mule, Mr. Harlan." She had Watts' string crime scene tape around the excavation site and called for a second deputy to come and secure the access gate. Joe gave his statement standing in the declining afternoon light while Watts photographed the scene from every angle. The field smelled of turned earth and iron, and something underneath those, something faintly sweet that Joe was starting to understand was old leather and old cloth and the particular smell of things that had been sealed away from air for a very long time. "The bones," Joe said, while Pruitt was writing in her notepad. "What happens to them?" "The forensic unit will take custody. They'll analyze them and determine whether charges are possible." She kept writing. "Given the apparent age of the chest and everything you've described, we're probably looking at historical remains, but the procedure is the same until we know more." "How old do you think it is?" Pruitt glanced at the coins, still lying where Joe had set them on the ground. "The most recent coin you saw. What year?" "I noticed one from 1939, one from 1941. Then the chest went in the ground sometime after 1941 at the earliest." She wrote something. "Could be later. The forensic anthropologist will give us a better window." The forensic unit arrived in 90 minutes. 2 people, a man named Ridley who did most of the talking and a younger woman named Chun who did most of the careful work. They photographed every item in sequence, enhanced lights setting up to cover the fading daylight, then removed items one by one into labeled evidence bags. The coins went individually and then into a larger container. The documents went flat. The oilcloth bundle with the bones went last, photographed from every angle before Chun lifted it with gloved hands and placed it in a separate sealed container. The leather journal they photographed. Closed, then opened to the title page. Then each subsequent page in sequence using a mounted camera that moved methodically across the text. Ridley stopped when he reached the title page and held the camera there longer than he'd held it on anything else. "Sheriff," Ridley called. Pruitt walked over. They spoke in voices too low for Joe to hear from behind the tape. She came back to him. "Mr. Harlan, the book is a journal. There's a name on the inside cover." "Whose?" "Luther Crane." She watched his face for recognition. "Does that mean anything to you?" Joe searched his memory with the specific attention you give to a name you think you might have heard once, years ago, at the edge of a conversation that might or might not have happened. He found nothing. No, he said. Should it? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. The forensic team is taking the journal as evidence. But I'd like to show you something first with Dr. Ridley's agreement. Ridley nodded. Pruitt walked Joe to where the journal lay open on a flat evidence pad Ridley had set on the ground. The pages were yellowed at the edges and fragile-looking, but the handwriting was clear. A strong hand, careful, the letters formed with intention. The ink had faded from black to dark brown, but was entirely readable. Joe read the first line on the first page. This is the property of Luther James Crane, farmer, of Cannon County, Tennessee. This record begun in the year of our Lord 1938. And then the second line. I set down here what I have earned and what I have built and what I mean to leave to my children and my children's children, so that they will know the worth of this land and the worth of the man who worked it. Joe straightened up. He did it slowly. This was his land, he said. It came out lower than he'd intended. Pruitt didn't answer that directly. We don't know yet. The investigation will determine that. But the journal was sitting in a chest that had been buried in this field for 80 years, and the field was on land that had been in Joe's family since 1943, and Luther Crane had written in 1938 about what he'd built and what he meant to leave to his children and his children's children. And a man who writes about land he intends to leave to his family does not leave it for $450 to a stranger 2 years after his most recent journal entry. Joe looked out across the field he'd spent 6 hours clearing, the dark-turned earth running to the far tree line. Something was forming at the back of his mind that he wasn't ready to look at directly. He had woken that morning thinking about how to save this farm. He was standing now over the chest of a man he'd never heard of, in a field his grandfather had sealed off with a story about a mule, and whatever shape was forming at the back of his mind was getting harder to avoid. The forensic team worked until the light failed entirely, setting up portable lights and continuing for another hour after sunset, finishing the documentation and then removing the chest itself. That required 4 people and considerable effort. The iron had corroded into the surrounding soil in a way that suggested it had been buried carefully, packed in tightly, deliberately placed deep enough that a plow would never reach it. Ridley came to Joe before they left. Forensic report will be 4 to 6 weeks. We share findings with the sheriff's office as they come in. He paused. The bones go to the state lab for analysis. Age, sex, cause of death if it's determinable. The coins will be cataloged and appraised by a specialist. Another pause, shorter. The journal is evidence right now, but the sheriff can arrange access for you once it's been processed. Given that the chest was found on your property, you have standing in the eventual ownership determination. What does that mean exactly? Ridley considered. It means this is complicated. If the items were buried by someone other than your family, and if that person had legal claim to this land, the items may belong to that person's heirs. If the land itself was obtained through fraud, he let the sentence end there. I'm a forensic technician, not a lawyer. I'd suggest getting one. Joe watched their vehicles pull out through the gate and down the track toward the county road. Watts had stayed to secure the site. The field looked wrong in the last light. His day's work, the disturbed earth running 6 acres, the tape around the hole itself. He'd cleared 6 acres before he hit it. The remaining 8 stood untouched, old grass pale and stiff in the October chill. He drove the tractor back to the barn, parked it, sat in the cab for a few minutes doing nothing in particular, his hands still on the steering wheel. Then he went inside. The kitchen smelled of Melissa's cooking, something with onions and canned tomatoes that was better than it had any right to be given what was in the pantry. Cody was at the table doing homework with the specific resentful concentration of a 3rd grader being made to do long division when there was television available. Harper was on the living room floor in her pajamas with crayons and a coloring book, narrating something to herself in the particular running commentary that 5-year-olds maintain. Melissa looked up when Joe came in. She could read him the way she'd always been able to read him, better than was entirely comfortable. What happened? He pulled out a chair and sat down. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was something she'd gotten from Ruth. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for Cody's pencil on paper and a low sound from the living room. "Human remains," Melissa said. "Yes." "In a chest." "In our field." "Yes." "And gold coins." 60 or 70 of them. "Gold." "Old ones." 1890s through the late 1930s. She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you know whose they were?" "The journal has a name in the front. Luther Crane. The sheriff's office has the journal. I won't be able to read it until they've processed it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I've never heard that name before." Melissa was quiet. The forensic technician said to get a lawyer, Joe said. "Because of the remains? Because if this land was obtained fraudulently, then the items in that chest might belong to someone else." The forensic guy was careful with how he said it, but that was the meaning. He said it plainly because it needed to be said plainly. And the land question might not stop with the items. Melissa absorbed that. She turned back to the stove, adjusted the burner, turned back. "You think Grandpa Earl had something to do with this?" "I don't know what I think. He told Dad not to touch that field." "He did." People don't warn their children to stay out of a field for 50 years because they buried a mule. Joe said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. Cody looked up from his homework. "Dad buried a mule?" "No, but," Melissa said, "eat your dinner." That night, Joe couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark with his eyes open and his mind turning over the same set of facts the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath it and then regret it. His grandfather Earl had bought this land in 1943. The deed was in the county records, filed properly with appropriate signatures. Joe had seen it years ago when he was getting the estate paperwork sorted after Doyle died. Everything in order, everything signed, the kind of documentation that closes questions, or seems to, except that a man named Luther Crane had started a journal in 1938 describing this same land as his own. And his bones, or what might be his bones, had been buried in a chest in the back field. The same field 3 generations of Harlan men had been warned to leave alone. Earl Harlan had died in 1967 with a reputation as a man who kept to himself. Joe had grown up with that description handed down at every family occasion, the way families pass down the things they've decided to believe about themselves. Hard worker, private man, built something from nothing, raised his family right. What if the nothing was someone else's something? Joe didn't sleep until close to 3, and even then it was shallow, restless, full of near dreams that aren't really dreams, just the day's images reassembling themselves in the dark. In the morning, he called the Cannon County Courthouse before they were officially open, and when the records clerk answered at 8 o'clock, he asked about land transfers for his parcel, specifically the years 1940 to 1950. The clerk said it would take a day or two to pull historical records, but that he was welcome to come in and look through them himself. He drove into Woodbury that morning, left Melissa with a short explanation that he needed to look at paperwork. She asked if she should come. He said not yet, and she accepted that without comment, which was its own kind of grace. The county courthouse was a brick building from the 1930s with high ceilings and the particular smell that government buildings in small Tennessee towns accumulate over decades, paper and floor wax, and the faint trace of every document ever filed. The records room was in the basement, maintained by a woman named Gladys who had worked there for 31 years and could retrieve any document from the last century with the focused efficiency of someone who genuinely loved the filing system. Joe gave her the parcel number and the years he was looking for. She returned in 12 minutes with a folder. The deed transfer was there, dated March 14th, 1943, transferring the land and all improvements from the Crane Family Trust to Earl Harlan for the sum of $450, notarized and signed by a county clerk named Philip Watkins. Joe read the name on the transferring side 3 times. Luther J. Crane. Gladys was watching him with the careful attention of someone who noticed when a document caused a reaction. She had the look of a woman who'd seen people find things in county records for 31 years, good news and bad news, answers they'd been looking for and answers they hadn't known they were looking for. And she knew the difference between someone who'd found what they came for and someone who'd found something else entirely. "Is there anything else in the record?" Joe asked. previous documents, prior ownership, survey records. She went away again and came back with another folder. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. The land had been recorded in Luther Crane's name since 1931. Before that, in his father's name, Elijah Crane, since 1908. The survey records described 212 acres, the same 212 acres the Harlan family had farmed for 80 years. Can I get copies of all of this? 25 cents a page. Fine. Joe sat at the long table in the records room while the copies printed. He looked at the 1943 transfer one more time. $450 for 212 acres of Tennessee Hill Country in 1943 would have been a fraction of what that land was worth by any honest measure. Well below wartime prices, well below what a man would accept, unless accepting was not entirely his choice. He thought about the gold coins, 60 or 70 of them, ranging from 1897 to the late 1930s. A man farming 200 acres for decades who didn't trust banks. Who saved in gold because gold was real in a way that paper wasn't, especially if you were a black farmer in Tennessee in the first half of the 20th century, and paper promises had a way of being reinterpreted by people with power, who built something acre by acre, year by year, and buried his savings in iron in the ground because that felt safer than any institution he'd been given reason to trust. He thought about the bones wrapped in oilcloth. $450. He drove back to the farm with the copies on the passenger seat. Halfway there, his phone rang. Sheriff Pruitt. Mr. Harlan, we've made some early progress on the record search. Can you come in this afternoon? I can be there at 2. Good. And Mr. Harlan, if you have a lawyer, bring one. I don't have one at the moment. A pause. Then I'd suggest you have one by 2 o'clock. He called the one attorney he knew personally, Gerald Sims, who'd handled his father's estate and a boundary dispute with a neighbor years back. Sims listened to a 3-minute summary and said he'd be at the sheriff's office at 2. The sheriff's office occupied a modern building on the square in Woodbury, cleaner than the courthouse, but carrying the same institutional smell. Pruitt met them in a conference room with Watts and a woman Joe hadn't met, introduced as Agent Patricia Morse from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Joe registered that. The TBI. This had moved up a level overnight. Pruitt spread photographs across the table. Photographs of the journal pages, enhanced for legibility. The coin collection, cataloged. The bones, measured and documented. We had the forensic lab do a preliminary on the bone fragments, Morse said. Given the nature of the situation, they prioritized it. The bones are from a human hand, left hand, consistent with an adult male. The condition and mineralization suggest they've been in the ground for 60 to 90 years. 60 to 90 years, Sims said, writing. If the chest was sealed in 1943 or thereabouts, that fits. Joe looked at the photographs of the journal pages. The handwriting was clear in the enhanced versions, that strong, careful hand forming letters with the intention of someone who'd learned to write well and treated the act as worth the effort. The journal, he said. Morse nodded. We've begun reviewing it. 147 pages, entries from 1938 through, based on the last dated entry, September 4th, 1943. The final entry is dated the day before the land transfer was recorded in the county ledger. The day before. Joe kept his expression steady. "What does it say?" Sims asked. Morse glanced at Pruitt, who nodded. "The early sections are personal records," Morse said. "Account of his farm operations, crop yields, expenses, a ledger of his savings." He was thorough. She picked up one of the enhanced photographs. He wrote about burying his savings in the field. He distrusted banks after 1931, which is understandable given the period. He referred to the iron case in the background, several entries, as his way of keeping his wealth secure. He didn't specify the exact location in the early entries. Joe thought about the gold coins again. 30 years of savings buried in iron in a field he believed was safe. The later entries are different in tone, Morse continued. Starting in early 1943, he began writing about a man named Earl Harlan, a neighbor who had made repeated inquiries about purchasing the land. Luther Crane refused each time. The entries describe increasing pressure, a visit from the county clerk, a document he was asked to sign that he described in his journal as not what it says it is. Moore set down one photograph and picked up another. A visit from two men whose names he didn't record, but described in considerable detail. The room was quiet. What was writing? Sims had stopped writing and was looking at Morse. The last entry, Morse said, is 11 lines. He wrote that Earl Harlan had come to his house the previous evening with the county clerk and two other men. He wrote that they told him the land had already been transferred in the county records, and that if he remained on the property, the men with Harlan would take steps he did not want to see taken. He wrote that he intended to drive to Nashville in the morning to consult a lawyer about the fraudulent transfer. Morse set down the photograph. There are no further entries. Sims set his pen down. He never got to Nashville. We don't know that definitively. But the land was recorded as transferred the following day, with Luther Crane listed as the seller. The notarized signature on the transfer document will be subject to forensic handwriting analysis to determine whether it's authentic. Joe was looking at the photograph of the journal's last page. 11 lines in that careful hand. A man who'd spent 5 years keeping exact records of everything he'd earned and built, setting down and writing what it all meant so his children would understand its worth. Ending mid-plan, mid-sentence, almost, on a September morning in 1943, with the intention of driving to Nashville and the certainty that the law would help him. "The bones," Joe said. "Are they his?" "We can't say that yet. DNA testing takes time, and we'd need something to compare against. That means locating surviving relatives, if there are any." Morse looked at him. "That's one reason we wanted you here today, Mr. Harlan. We need to know everything your family passed down about how this property was acquired." Joe thought about his grandfather's reputation. Hard worker, private man. He thought about the field sealed off with a story about a mule for 50-plus years. He thought about the coins Luther Crane had buried in iron in the ground to keep them safe from people he had good reason not to trust. He thought about 11 lines and no more entries and a drive to Nashville that apparently never happened. "I'll tell you everything I know," Joe said, "which isn't much, but I can tell you what I've begun to understand this morning." He put the courthouse copies on the table. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Joe gave a complete account of what he knew about the farm's history, which amounted to the stories passed down and the documents he'd found at the courthouse that morning. Pruitt and Morse listened and asked measure questions. Sims intervened twice when the questions moved toward areas with direct legal implications. At the end, Morse told him the TBI would be opening a formal investigation into the 1943 land transfer and the circumstances surrounding Luther Crane's disappearance. The case was classified as a historical criminal matter, which meant different evidentiary procedures than a current crime, but it was still a criminal investigation. "What does this mean for the property in the near term?" Sims asked. "Right now, nothing changes immediately. The investigation needs to run. If forensic evidence and document analysis confirm the transfer was fraudulent, we're looking at a legal proceeding to determine rightful ownership." Morse looked at Joe directly. "That's ultimately a civil matter, outside our scope. But if Luther Crane's heirs exist," Sims said, "they could have a claim to the property." "Yes." Joe drove home with the weight of everything he'd heard settled over him like weather. The farm was on his right as the county road curved east, the barns first and then the house, the old white farmhouse where he'd been born and where his children had grown up and where Ruth had spent her last months in the bedroom they'd shared for 30 years. He sat in the truck in the driveway for a while. 212 acres. His grandfather's land. His father's land. His land. The land he'd worked his entire adult life. The land he was about to lose to a bank because of a drought and a medical catastrophe and the grinding arithmetic of modern farming. And before all of that, before all of his family's story, it had been Luther Crane's land, earned through 30 years of work, saved for over decades in gold hidden in iron in the ground. He thought about Doyle, his father, who'd repeated his own father's instruction about the back field without question, the way sons do when fathers speak with enough certainty. Doyle had been a straightforward man, not given to cruelty, not given to deception either. Joe didn't believe Doyle had known what was in the ground. The instruction had just been passed along the way certain things pass through families, embedded in routine, explained by a story about a mule that nobody had ever thought to examine closely. That was the cruelest part of it, maybe, that the crime had been committed once, in 1943, by one man who'd then sealed it off behind a simple story, and every generation after had simply inherited the silence without knowing what they were inheriting along with the land. Melissa came out onto the porch. She'd seen the truck and waited the appropriate amount of time before coming to check on him. He got out. She could see in the way he moved. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She sat on the porch steps while he stood in the yard. The kids were inside. The light was going golden and low in the west, the long October light that makes fields look better than they are. "Grandpa Earl killed him," Melissa said. Not a question, a quiet statement of what they were both already thinking. "We don't know that yet." A man wrote in a journal for 5 years about his farm and his savings and what he meant to leave his children. Then he wrote that Earl Harlan showed up at his house with the county clerk and 2 other men, and there were no more entries. And his bones were in the ground in a field your grandfather sealed off and told everyone to stay out of for the rest of his life. Joe had no answer for any of that. "We've been living on his land," Melissa said. "Farming it. This whole time. All of us." "Yes." She looked at the house she'd grown up in, the house she'd come back to when her own life came apart, the house where her kids were inside right now watching television. "What happens to the farm?" "I don't know yet. The investigation has to run first. The ownership question comes after. But if there are heirs, if Luther Crane has living descendants." Joe sat down on the step beside her. "Then the right thing is pretty clear, even if it's hard." Melissa was quiet for a while. "Is there a right thing that doesn't mean we lose everything?" "I don't know that yet either." The light shifted. The crows settled in the tree line at the far edge of the fields. In the back 14 acres, the crime scene tape was probably still visible from here if you looked, a faint orange line crossing the turned earth. "He buried his savings to keep them safe," Joe said. "He buried them because he couldn't trust the banks, because that wasn't always a safe choice for a black farmer in Tennessee in the 1930s. He buried 60-odd years of gold in the ground, and he wrote down in a journal everything he'd built so his children would know exactly what it was worth." He looked at the dark earth of the cleared field, just visible at the edge of the failing light. "And someone put him in the ground next to it." Neither of them spoke for a time. Inside, Harper called for her mother about something small and immediate the way 5-year-olds do, and Melissa got up and went in, and Joe sat alone on the porch steps as the last light went out of the October sky and the cold settled down over the fields. Luther Crane had planted something in that ground. Not just gold, not just bones. He'd planted the record of a life, 147 pages of careful writing that had waited 80 years in the dark for someone to dig in the right place. Joe had spent the day looking for a way to save his farm. He'd found someone else's instead. And somewhere out there, if Luther Crane's children had had children of their own, they were living without knowing what their grandfather had left them, without knowing what had been taken from them, without knowing that in a field in Cannon County, Tennessee, under 18 inches of Tennessee clay, the whole truth had been sitting in an iron chest, patient and cold and perfectly preserved, waiting for a farmer who was desperate enough to break ground in a field he'd been told his whole life to leave alone. He thought about that word, desperate. He'd driven into that field this morning out of desperation, out of the particular kind of fear that makes a man try things he wouldn't otherwise try. And desperation had led him straight to a chest that a different kind of man had sealed in the ground out of his own fear. The fear of being erased, of everything he'd built being taken from him without recourse, without record. Luther Crane had buried the record of his life in iron, so that even if he himself could be silenced, the evidence of what he'd earned and what had been stolen could not be. That was what the journal was in the end. A man's refusal to disappear completely. Tomorrow, the investigation would deepen. The forensic results would begin coming back. The question of heirs would need to be answered. There were people somewhere whose lives were about to change in ways none of them could yet imagine. And Joe Harlan, farmer, 61 years old, 3 weeks from foreclosure, who'd driven his tractor into a fallow field looking for any possible way forward, was the man who'd opened the door. He just didn't know yet what was going to come through it. The week after the discovery was the strangest kind of waiting. The farm still needed its daily work, and Joe did it the way he'd done everything since Ruth died, by moving through the hours with enough purpose to keep his mind from sitting down too long on any one thing. Cows fed, equipment checked, the early core in the east field walked for signs of the fungal blight that had cost him 3 rows the previous fall. Normal work, normal hours. Except that every morning when the light came over the tree line and hit the back 14 acres, his eye went to the crime scene tape and the staked markers and the hole in the ground where the chest had been, and the normal feeling left him entirely. Melissa had started researching. She hadn't said she was going to, but Joe found her at the kitchen table 2 nights after the discovery with her laptop open and a legal pad full of handwriting beside it, and she looked up without embarrassment. She'd pulled census record from 1930 and 1940. Luther Crane was listed both times, head of household, occupation farmer, race listed in the column that census takers used for that purpose in those years. His wife's name was Ida. 2 children, a daughter named Dorothy, born 1935, and a son named Calvin, born 1937. Calvin would have been 6 when Luther Crane disappeared. Dorothy would have been 8. Joe pulled out a chair and sat down across from his daughter. She pushed the legal pad toward him. She'd made a timeline. 1908, Elijah Crane files for title on the land. 1931, Luther Crane's name on the deed. 1938, Luther starts his journal. March 1943, the transfer recorded. September 4th, 1943, the last journal entry. Below the timeline, Melissa had written 2 names with question marks after each. Dorothy Crane, Calvin Crane, and below those, the word descendants underlined twice. I haven't found them yet, she said, but I know where to look next. Joe looked at the timeline. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. She said it without heat, the way she said things she'd already decided. If there are people out there who belong to him, they deserve to know. Whatever that means for us. The whatever that means for us hung in the air between them. Joe didn't push it down. It needed to stay there, visible, because ignoring it wouldn't make it smaller. How's the legal situation? Melissa asked. She meant the foreclosure. Sims filed for a temporary extension given the active TBI investigation. First Consolidated hasn't agreed to it yet, but they haven't refused either. Banks don't love complicating an asset they're trying to foreclose on with an active criminal investigation into the title. Joe folded the legal pad back to her. We got some time, maybe 6 weeks. 6 weeks to figure out what was right and what was possible and whether those 2 things are going to converge anywhere on the same map. It wasn't much time, but 6 weeks was 6 weeks, and Joe had been working with not enough time since February and had mostly learned how to stretch it without breaking it. Agent Morse called 3 days later with an update. The forensic handwriting analysis of a 1943 deed was underway and would take 2 to 3 more weeks. The bone analysis was in progress at the state lab, and the TBI had located records from the Cannon County Sheriff's Office from 1943, specifically a report filed September 8th, for days after Luther Crane's last journal entry, classifying him as a voluntary departure, no crime suspected. The report had been filed by the duty officer. The sheriff at the time had been a man named Harold Pruitt, who had died in 1971. Harold Pruitt, Joe repeated. Related to the current sheriff? As it happens, Morse said. Dana Pruitt's maiden name was Pruitt. Her grandfather. Joe sat with that for a moment. Does she know? She knew the moment I mentioned the name. She came to me before I had a chance to come to her. A pause. She's not conflicted about the investigation, Mr. Harlan. She's the one who called the TBI in the first place. But I wanted you to know. Joe thought about Pruitt's face in the backfield, the careful neutral she'd maintained while looking at the journal. Maybe it wasn't just professional discipline. Maybe she'd already understood, at some level, what her grandfather's name in a file from 1943 might eventually mean. The coin specialist arrived on a Thursday. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Marsh, and she drove up from Nashville in a clean gray sedan carrying aluminum case the size of a briefcase and the particular focused calm of someone who spent her professional life with very old, very valuable things. She was 64, with silver hair cut close and glasses on a cord around her neck that she raised to her face with the automatic precision of long habit. She'd spent 30 years as a numismatist, the last 12 running her own appraisal firm. The TBI had contracted her through standard channels, and she'd cleared her schedule when they told her what they had. The coins had been transferred to a secure location at the TBI field office in Murfreesboro, and that was where Marsh examined them, with Joe and Sims present by arrangement and Pruitt and Morse observing. The coins were laid out on a padded examination table under controlled lighting, each one in a small labeled tray. Marsh worked through them without hurry. She used a loop and a reference catalog and, occasionally, a small scale. She made notes in a leather-bound book in a handwriting even more compressed and precise than Luther Crane's. For 2 hours the room was mostly quiet, punctuated by the occasional soft sound of a coin being set down in its tray. When she finished, she looked up. She had the expression of someone who'd confirmed what they expected and was choosing her words carefully regardless. 67 coins, she said. 41 Liberty Head Double Eagles, which are $20 gold pieces. 14 St. Gaudens Double Eagles, the same denomination, minted between 1907 and 1932. 8 Morgan silver dollars, though those are silver rather than gold and represent a small fraction of the total value. And 4 additional pieces, 2 coronet head eagles at $10 face value and 2 half eagles at $5. She set down her loop. The gold content alone, at current spot prices, comes to approximately $840,000. The room was quiet. That's melt value, Marsh continued. Which is the floor? Several of these pieces are in conditions that significantly exceed bullion value. This 1907 St. Gaudens, for example. She gestured to a coin in a tray at the far end of the table. High relief version. Mintage of approximately 12,000. The condition is near mint. At current collector market, that single coin is worth between $40,000 and $60,000 on its own. She went through 6 more individual pieces with specific valuations. Joe stopped tracking the individual numbers and started waiting for the total. Marsh closed her reference catalog. My preliminary estimate for the full collection, accounting for individual collector premiums on the exceptional pieces and standard market rates for the remainder, is between $2 million and $2.4 million. I'll have a formal written appraisal within 10 days. Joe heard Sims write something. He heard Morse shift in her chair. He kept his own hands flat on the table. $2 million. Luther Crane had buried $2 million in his field. Not $2 million in 1943, of course. In 1943, the gold would have represented a lifetime of careful savings, tens of thousands of dollars of the prices of the time, built over 35 years of farming 212 acres of Tennessee Hill Country. But 70 years of gold price appreciation had turned careful savings into something else entirely, something that would matter enormously to whoever had the legal right to it. Joe thought about what it meant to save in gold when you couldn't trust the banks. Black farmers in the rural South in the 1930s had practical reasons not to trust the banking system. Institutions that regularly denied loans, that foreclosed on land for infractions that white neighbors were given latitude on, that treated deposits as somehow less secure when the depositor had the wrong name or the wrong face. Luther Crane hadn't saved in gold because he was eccentric or fearful without cause. He'd saved in gold because he'd done the math on what options were actually available to him and chosen the one that couldn't be seized by a bank examiner or devalued by a hostile clerk. He'd been right about the risk. He just underestimated which direction the threat would come from. Dr. Marsh, Sims said, in your professional experience, is there anything about the composition of this collection that speaks to how it was assembled over time? Marsh considered. The dates span 1887 to 1939. The coins show varying degrees of wear consistent with handling, but the wear patterns are consistent with a single collector rather than multiple sources. The mix of denominations, the way the earlier pieces are more worn than the later ones, all of it is consistent with a man who accumulated gold systematically over decades and handled his older coins more than his newer ones. This wasn't a sudden acquisition. This was a life savings. She looked at the coins in their trays, 67 pieces of gold that a man had collected one at a time over the course of his working life and buried in iron in the ground to keep them from being taken. Whoever put this together, Marsh said, did it with considerable discipline. On the drive back to Woodbury, Joe sat in the passenger seat of Sims's car and looked at the landscape moving past. The counties blurred together out the window, Tennessee farmland in October, the harvested fields pale and the woodlets still holding their last color. He thought about discipline, about a man who'd farmed 200 acres and saved in gold when he could have spent, who'd kept meticulous records when nobody required him to, who'd written in a journal for 5 years about the worth of what he'd built so that his children would understand it after he was gone. Luther Crane had been trying to create permanence. He'd understood, at some level, that the things he'd built could be taken from him, and he'd done what he could to create a record that couldn't be erased. The journal, the carefully sealed chest, the coins wrapped in canvas to protect them from moisture. Every decision he'd made in sealing that chest had been made by someone who understood that he might not be there to explain himself. He just hadn't been able to anticipate how complete the erasure would be, that his children would grow up thinking he'd left them, that the story would hold for 80 years, that the only way his record would survive was if someone drove a tractor into a fallow field on a desperate October morning and hit iron at 18 inches. He just hadn't been able to anticipate that. Nobody could have. 3 days after the appraisal, Melissa found Dorothy Crane in the records. She came to Joe in the late afternoon while he was in the barn doing maintenance on the tractor. She stood in the barn doorway with her laptop open, the October light behind her, and she looked like someone who'd found something important and hadn't yet decided how to feel about it. Dorothy Crane became Dorothy Sutton in 1956, Melissa said, married a man named Raymond Sutton in Nashville. She had 2 children, a son who died in infancy in 1959, and a daughter. Joe set down his wrench. The daughter's name is Ruby. Ruby Sutton Washington. She's 68 years old. She retired 4 years ago after 35 years as a school principal in the Metro Nashville district. Melissa looked at the screen. She lives on Woodland Street in East Nashville. She has a listed phone number. Joe wiped his hands on a shop rag and said nothing for a moment. Her mother Dorothy died in 2018, Melissa continued. She was 82, so she never knew. Melissa paused. Or if she knew it the way people know things they've spent their whole lives working to forget. Joe thought about what it would mean for a woman who'd grown up without her father, who'd raised her daughter in the silence of that absence, who'd died at 82, still carrying whatever version of the story she'd told herself. Does Ruby know anything about her grandfather? Joe asked. I don't know, but she's the one we need to call. I know. He didn't call that day. He thought about how to do it, which was different from postponing it, though the difference was fine enough that he checked himself twice. He wasn't avoiding the call. He was trying to figure out how to make it without causing more damage than necessary to a woman who had no idea what was coming. The next morning, he called Pruitt and told her he wanted to contact the surviving Crane family member directly before the TBI did, if that was permitted. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. It's not standard. I know. but she's going to be hearing that her grandfather was possibly murdered on land that my family has farmed for 80 years. I'd rather she hear that from me first than from a TBI agent she's never met. Another pause. I'll ask Morse. Morse's answer, relayed through Pruitt an hour later, was that Joe was free to make contact as a private individual, that the TBI would be in touch with Ms. Washington regardless, and that if Joe's call preceded theirs, it didn't create a legal problem as long as he wasn't attempting to influence her or the investigation. Joe wrote down what he wanted to say. Not a script, just the main things. He crossed out several versions of the opening before settling on the plainest one. He'd been thinking about this call for 2 days, and the thing he kept coming back to was that there was no good way to make it. There was no phrasing that would make the news easier. The only thing he could control was whether she heard it with some dignity, from someone who was being straight with her, or whether she heard it cold from a law enforcement agent who'd never had any reason to care about what her family had carried. He sat at the kitchen table, Melissa in the other room with the kids, the farm quiet outside. Then he made the call. Ruby Washington answered on the second ring. Her voice was the practiced neutral of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's crises and had learned to keep her own reactions behind a door until she knew what she was dealing with. Ms. Washington, my name is Joe Harlan. I'm a farmer in Cannon County, Tennessee. He paused. I found something on my property last week that I believe belonged to your grandfather. Silence. For seconds of it. My grandfather, she said. Luther Crane. Yes, ma'am. More silence. Then, carefully, Mr. Harlan, my grandfather disappeared when my mother was 8 years old. Nobody in my family has spoken his name in 60 years. I know, and I'm sorry to be the person who's bringing it back. Joe looked at the notes he'd written. He set them aside. I found a chest buried in a field on my property. Inside it was a journal. His journal. 147 pages he wrote between 1938 and 1943. His savings. His records. Everything he'd built. A pause. There were also human remains. He heard her breath change. There's a TBI investigation open. They'll be contacting you formally. But I want to call you first because what happened to your grandfather happened on my land, and I think my family may be the reason he disappeared. I'm not going to ask you not to pursue this. I'm calling because you have the right to know from me directly. Ruby Washington was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different. The professional neutral was still there, but something had shifted underneath it. He didn't abandon them, she said. My mother always said he abandoned them. My grandmother told her that. Told both of them. A man who went away and didn't come back. He didn't abandon them, Joe said. Another silence. Then, I need to come to Tennessee. She didn't ask if that was all right. It wasn't a question. Joe hadn't expected it to be. Yes, he said. I think you should. After he hung up, he sat at the table for a few minutes without moving. Melissa came in, read his face, and sat down across from him without asking anything. He told her how the call had gone. She didn't cry. Melissa said, No. Melissa thought about that. That's not the same as not feeling it. I know. How are you doing? Joe considered the question honestly, which was the kind of question that deserved honesty. I don't know yet. I feel like I've been walking towards something for 2 weeks without being able to see it clearly, and now it's right in front of me, and I still can't entirely see it. He looked at his hands. Whatever happens next, I think it's going to be hard for a while. Yeah, Melissa said, but you called her. You didn't wait for the TBI to do it. That matters. She arrived 4 days later. Melissa picked her up from a Nashville airport in Joe's truck because Joe's truck was the only vehicle they had that was reliable enough for the 100-mile drive without worry. And Melissa had insisted on going, partly out of courtesy and partly, Joe suspected, because she wanted to be the first person Ruby Washington met. She wanted to be someone who looked like a person trying to do right before Ruby had a chance to build any other picture. Ruby Washington was 68 years old and had the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the person everyone else came to when things went wrong. She was tall, with her hair gone silver and close cropped, and she carried herself with the straight spine of a woman who'd learned early that posture was a form of communication and had never stopped using it. She wore a dark coat and practical shoes, and she brought a single overnight bag, which told Joe, when Melissa described her, that she'd packed for a short trip, maybe because she wasn't sure yet how long she'd want to stay. Joe met them in the driveway. Ruby Washington looked at him for a moment with the measuring quality of someone who'd spent 35 years sizing up situations and people before deciding what they required. Then she offered her hand. "Mr. Harlan, Ms. Washington, thank you for coming. Thank you for calling." She looked past him at the farmhouse, at the barns, at the fields beyond. "How long has your family been here?" 80 years. She took that in without visible reaction. "And you didn't know?" "No, ma'am. I don't believe my father knew either. My grandfather took whatever he knew to his grave." Ruby looked at the farm with the particular attention of someone encountering a place that belongs in some way to their own history. Not nostalgia. She'd never seen it before. Something more complicated than that. The recognition of a story you've been living inside without knowing it. "It's good land," she said finally. Not warmly, just accurately. The assessment of someone who'd grown up hearing about land from a mother who'd grown up on it, even if neither of them had known the full story of how that land was lost. He showed her the back field first. The walk was about a quarter-mile from the house, through the gate and along the fallow edge of the cleared acres, and Ruby walked it without speaking. When they reached the excavation site, she stood at the edge with her arms at her sides and looked at the hole in the ground. The forensic markers were still up, small numbered flags in the soil. The October wind moved through the old grass of the untouched 8 acres beside them. She looked at the hole for a long time. Joe had been out here every morning since the discovery, checking the tape, keeping people from wandering onto the site, and each time he stood at this edge, he felt the same thing. A weight that was partly grief and partly something older and harder to name. He felt it now, standing beside her. "He's been here this whole time," she said. Joe didn't offer anything to fill the silence that followed. Some silences needed to be what they were. After a while, Ruby turned from the field. "The journal. When can I read it?" "The TBI has it as evidence. But Sheriff Pruitt arranged for you to see it. Photograph copies, full resolution. We're meeting with Agent Morse tomorrow morning." Ruby nodded. She looked at the field one more time, then turned toward the house. "Tell me about this family. Your grandfather." Joe told her what he knew, which wasn't much. Earl Harlan, private man, hard worker, died before Joe was born. The story about the mule. Doyle passing the instruction along without question. The field sitting fallow for 80 years until desperation drove Joe into it with a tractor. Ruby listened. She had the quality of a careful listener, the kind who was actually processing what you said rather than waiting for a gap to speak. When he finished, she said, "Your grandfather kept that field empty his whole life." "Yes, because he knew what was in it." "I believe so." Ruby was quiet. "My mother's whole life was shaped by what she thought her father had done. She thought he chose to leave. She raised me with that. That men leave, that you can't trust permanence." She looked at the kitchen table where they were sitting. She died thinking that, and none of it was true. Joe had been thinking about what to say to that for 4 days and still didn't have it. He settled for the truth. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't reach what it needs to." "No," Ruby said. "It doesn't. But I appreciate that you said it plain." The meeting with Morse the next morning was in the same conference room at the sheriff's office. Pruitt was there, and Sims, and a TBI attorney named Doyle that Morse had brought in from the Nashville field office. Ruby Washington had her own attorney, a woman named Camille Archer from Nashville who specialized in civil rights and property law, and who had, based on her expression when she walked in, already reviewed everything Morse had sent over and formed clear opinions about it. Morse laid out the forensic results as they stood. The coin appraisal, $2 million to $2.4 million. The handwriting analysis of the 1943 deed transfer. Preliminary results indicated a high probability of forgery. The signature attributed to Luther Crane on the transfer document showed inconsistencies with signatures found on other county documents from the same period, specifically a water rights application from 1940 and a tax payment receipt for 1941. The analysis wasn't final, but Morse said the examiner had used the word compelling. Camille Archer wrote something on her legal pad. The bone analysis was still pending. DNA comparison required a reference sample from a biological relative, which was now possible with Ruby Washington present. Morse asked if Ruby would consent to a cheek swab. Ruby said yes before Archer could respond, then looked at her attorney and said, "I want to know." The swab was done in the room, quick and clinical, and sent out immediately. Then Morse opened a laptop and turned it to face Ruby. The journal photographs enhanced every page. Ruby looked at the first page for a long time without touching the laptop. "This is the property of Luther James Crane, farmer of Cannon County, Tennessee. This record begun in the year of our Lord 1938. He had good handwriting," Ruby said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when they're being held there by deliberate effort. "He did," Morse said. Ruby began reading. Nobody said anything. Morse had cleared the next 2 hours, and Archer sat beside her client with her hands folded on the table. And Pruitt stood near the door, and Joe and Sim sat at the far end of the table and waited. It took Ruby 40 minutes to read through the full journal and photographs, moving through the pages at the pace of someone absorbing rather than just reading. Joe watched her face change as she went. The early entries were records, dry and specific, and her expression was focused and clinical. As the entries moved into 1941 and 1942 and the tone shifted, a tightness came in her jaw. When she reached the final pages, the entries about Earl Harlan and the county clerk and the men who came to the house, her jaw set and stayed set. She read the last entry twice. Joe knew when she'd finished it because she sat without moving for about 30 seconds, her eyes still on the screen, but not moving. There was a 1941 entry she went back to twice. Joe couldn't see the exact page for where he sat, but he saw her scroll back to it, read it, pause, scroll forward, then come back to it again. Later, when she described what it said, he understood why. Luther Crane had written about teaching his daughter Dorothy to count the coins. 8 years old in 1943, which meant 6 in 1941. He'd let her hold the gold pieces and count them out loud. He'd told her that each one represented a month of careful work, that together they represented the farm that would one day be hers and her brother Calvin's, that money kept in gold in the ground was money that couldn't be taken by the wrong people at the wrong time. He told a 6-year-old the truth about the world in the way that parents who've lived close to the edge of things do, plainly and early, because softening it doesn't protect children, it just leaves them unprepared. Dorothy had grown up thinking her father walked away. She'd raised Ruby with the bone-deep belief that men didn't stay, that you built your life on what you could control, that permanence was something other people got. Ruby had carried that into 35 years of school administration, into a marriage that had eventually ended, and a life she'd built with deliberate self-sufficiency. She thought it came from her grandmother's practicality, from her mother's stoicism. Now she was reading the handwriting of a man who tried to give his daughter a different story and been stopped before he could tell it. She read the last entry twice. Joe knew when she'd finished because she sat without moving for about 30 seconds, her eyes still on the screen, but not moving. He was going to drive to Nashville. She said, "Yes," Morse said. He thought the law would help him. Nobody answered that one. Ruby closed the laptop gently, the way you close something that deserves to be treated carefully. "My mother was 8 years old when this was written." He was describing a farm he'd built to leave to her. He was doing it so she'd know. She looked at the closed laptop. She spent her whole life thinking he didn't want her. The room held that. What happened next came from a direction Joe hadn't anticipated. He'd been watching for the TBI investigation to generate opposition from somewhere in the county bureaucracy, from people who might feel threatened by an inquiry into historical records. What he hadn't expected was for it to come so quickly and from such a specific source. On the 6th day after Ruby's arrival, Sims called Joe at 7 in the morning. His voice had the particular controlled quality of a lawyer who had received bad news and was processing it into useful information before he passed it on. "I got a letter this morning," Sims said, "from a firm called Stager and Associates. Frank Stager, he's been practicing in Woodbury for 25 years. Old family connections in the county. He's representing a client he won't name. And the letter claims that your continued cooperation with the TBI investigation and your contact with Luther Crane's descendants constitutes tortious interference with settled property rights." Joe sat down on the porch steps. "He's claiming what?" He's claiming that the 1943 transfer is legally valid, that 80 years of uncontested Harlan ownership creates a form of adverse possession protection, and that by cooperating with an investigation that seeks to void the transfer, you're acting against your own property interests. Sims paused. It's creative, and most of it won't hold up, but the point isn't to win in court. The point is to make the process feel expensive enough that you start weighing the cost of continuing. There was more to the letter. A paragraph that described the health of the local farm economy and the importance of title certainty to future land transactions. A sentence noting that reputations in small counties were easily damaged and slowly repaired. Nothing that crossed into explicit threat. All of it calibrated to read as reasonable concern to someone who didn't understand exactly what was happening, and as a clear warning to someone who did. Who's the client? He won't say. But Steger has historically represented the Watkins family in this county. Phil Watkins was the county clerk who notarized the 1943 transfer. His great-nephew, Dale Watkins, still lives here, still has interests in several county properties that changed hands around the same period. Several of them under circumstances that Morse tells me are now attracting additional scrutiny. Joe looked at the back field from a porch. The forensic markers were still there, small flags in the turned earth. What do we do? We respond with a letter that makes clear we understand exactly what they're doing and that it won't affect our cooperation with the state criminal investigation. Sims paused again, and we tell Morse about it today. Morse's reaction to the Steger letter was brief and direct. She called it what it was and said she would be visiting Steger's office that afternoon. She also said something Joe hadn't expected, that the letter, by surfacing a represented party with an active interest in suppressing the investigation, had just given her another thread to pull. Camille Archer's reaction was different. She read the letter standing, handed it back to Archer without comment, looked at Joe, and said 3 words, "They're scared now." The word "now" carrying everything. Ruby Washington read the letter standing. She handed it back to Archer without comment, looked at Joe, and said, "Do you want to stop?" The question was direct and genuine. No challenge in it. No expectation in either direction. A woman who'd spent a career dealing with difficult situations, asking the relevant question before anything else. Joe thought about it for the length of time the question deserved. He thought about the debt, about the foreclosure hearing, about Melissa and Cody and Harper, about the farm his father had farmed and his grandfather had farmed before him. He thought about Earl Harlan dying in 1967 with his secret intact and his reputation unchallenged and his son inheriting land that had never been his to give. "No," he said. Ruby nodded once, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already expected but needed to hear confirmed. Steger's visit from Morse produced results faster than anyone had predicted. Faced with a TBI agent asking pointed questions about his client's identity and the timing of the threatening letter, Steger disclosed that his client was not Dale Watkins, but a local land investment company called Ridgeline Holdings, which owns several parcels adjacent to the Harlan farm. Ridgeline Holdings had been incorporated in 2019 by a Nashville developer named Carson Webb, who had been quietly acquiring farmland in Cannon County for 3 years. He had been in preliminary discussions with First Consolidated Bank about purchasing the Harlan property in a foreclosure sale. Joe was the last to find out about Webb. Sims called him on a Sunday evening with the full picture, and Joe sat at the kitchen table with the phone in his hand and looked at nothing in particular for a while. A developer from Nashville had known about the foreclosure and had been waiting for the bank to complete it, at which point he would acquire 212 acres of Cannon County farmland at a distressed price. He would have gotten it cheap, too, because distressed prices at foreclosure are always below value, and First Consolidated wanted the debt resolved cleanly and quickly. Webb would have turned around and sold it for development or held it for appreciation, and the Harlan farm would have become something other than a farm, and Luther Crane's field would have been graded over for whatever came next. Instead, Joe had found a chest, and the TBI investigation had clouded the title, and Webb had retained a local attorney to send an intimidating letter. The intimidating letter had accomplished the opposite of what it was meant to. Instead of making Joe reconsider, it had brought Morse into a conference room with Steger and surfaced a connection that opened an entirely new line of inquiry. Does he know about the appraisal? Joe asked Sims. Not officially, but word travels in a county this size. $2.4 million was a number that traveled. Morse opened a separate inquiry into Ridgeline Holdings and its potential connection to any effort to impede the investigation. Webb's attorney issued a public statement claiming his client had no interest in the matter beyond the protection of a potential business opportunity. The phrasing so careful it practically announced what it was trying to conceal. Morse responded with a subpoena for all communications between Webb's office and First Consolidated Bank regarding the Harlan property, going back 3 years. The bank, suddenly aware that its foreclosure proceedings were now adjacent to a TBI investigation into historic criminal fraud and a possible obstruction inquiry, requested an indefinite extension of the foreclosure hearing date. Sims called Joe with this news on a Monday morning, and Joe listened and then asked, "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the bank doesn't want to be anywhere near this right now. They don't want to foreclose on land whose title is under active criminal investigation. It creates liability. It looks bad in print." Sims's voice carried the measured relief of a man who'd been managing bad news for weeks and was now managing news that was merely complicated, which was an improvement. "You're not losing the farm this month." Joe sat with that for a moment. Not this month. Not a solution. Not the end of the debt. But time, which was what he'd needed since February and hadn't been able to find anywhere. Time had come from the least expected place, from a chest in the ground and the records inside it, and a woman in Nashville whose grandfather had been buried in a back field for 80 years. The DNA results came back on a Thursday, 10 days after Ruby's swab had been sent. Morse called Joe first because he was the property owner of record, and then called Ruby. Joe drove to Woodbury to hear it in person, and Ruby was already there when he arrived, sitting in the conference room with Archer and a cup of coffee that she hadn't touched. The forensic anthropologist from the state lab presented the results in the flat, careful language of someone whose job required precision over drama. The bone fragments recovered from the chest were consistent with an adult male, age estimated 40 to 55 at time of death, based on skeletal indicators. Death had occurred 60 to 90 years prior, consistent with the estimated burial date of the chest. And the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the bone fragments showed a match to the sample provided by Ruby Washington with a probability of greater than 99.7% that the remains were from a direct maternal line relative. Luther Crane's bones had been in that field for 80 years. Ruby Washington did not cry in the conference room. She sat very still for about 30 seconds with her hands flat on the table. Then she said, "My grandmother told my mother he abandoned them." Morse said, yes. She might have believed that herself, if they didn't tell her what happened. That's possible. Joe thought about that. Ida Crane, the wife Luther had mentioned in the journal, the woman who'd raised Dorothy and Calvin on her own after September 1943. What had she been told? Earl Harlan and his men would have given her some version of a story, maybe that Luther had taken money and left, maybe simply that he was gone and wasn't coming back, and asking questions would be a mistake. The story just needed to be plausible enough that a woman with 2 small children and no legal standing and nobody to go to would accept it. And so Dorothy grew up with a father who'd abandoned her, and Dorothy raised Ruby with that as a fact about the world, and Ruby carried it for 68 years without any reason to question it. Until a tractor hit iron at 18 inches in a fallow field in Cannon County. He was in his field, Ruby said. He never left. Nobody spoke. He built that chest, Ruby said. He sealed his savings in it and put in the ground because he was afraid. Because he knew they were coming and he wanted his children to have what he'd saved, even if he couldn't protect it himself. He was trying to protect them from what he could see coming. Joe thought about the journal. The careful entries, the dates of the gold coins, the way the later entries changed in tone as the pressure from Earl Harlan increased, the way they documented everything with more urgency and less reflection, a man writing faster as the clock ran down. He got the chest in the ground, Joe said. He got the journal sealed inside it. They came before he could get to Nashville. Ruby looked at him. But the chest held. The chest had held. For 80 years, through droughts and floods, and the particular indifference of Tennessee clay, the iron had held. The journal had held. The coins had held. Luther Crane's record of his own life had held in the ground until the exact combination of events required to surface it finally occurred. A farmer in debt, a field never plowed, and a tractor bucket that hit iron at 18 inches. That was what he was counting on, Ruby said. He wasn't counting on the law. He wasn't counting on anyone believing him. He was counting on the iron. Joe thought about that. A man who'd learned exactly how much he could rely on other people's goodwill and had done his accounting accordingly. Who'd saved in gold because paper promises required someone else's cooperation to honor. Who'd sealed his record in iron because iron didn't require anyone to care. Who'd buried it deep enough that it could wait as long as it needed to. He'd been right about all of it. The iron had held. The record had survived. The truth had waited. That evening, Joe and Ruby and Melissa sat on the porch as the light went. Cody and Harper were inside, homework and television respectively, and the farm sounds were winding down the way they do at the end of an October day, the particular settling quiet of a working property after the work is done. Ruby had her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She'd been at the farm 3 days now, and she'd stopped, looking at it the way she'd looked at it when she arrived, with the measuring distance of someone assessing a foreign place. She looked at it now the way people look at things they're starting to understand from the inside. There'd been a moment that afternoon, before they came back to the house, when Ruby had walked to the far edge of the back field alone. Joe had watched from a distance, not wanting to follow, understanding that she needed the space. She'd stood at the far fence line for about 10 minutes, facing east, looking at the tree line. He didn't know what she was thinking. He hadn't asked. Some things were private in a way that had nothing to do with secrecy. When she came back, her expression was the same as it had been before she walked away. That was a kind of strength, he thought. The ability to go somewhere hard inside yourself and come back with your face arranged. He'd seen that quality in Ruth during the worst of her illness. The way she'd come back from the hard interior places looking the same, or almost the same, so that the kids at her school didn't have to carry her fear along with their own days. Now, on the porch, Melissa had gone quiet in the way she went quiet when she understood that something important was being figured out and that her job was to be present without directing it. "What do you want?" Ruby asked Joe. Not hostile. The same direct question she'd asked in the conference room. Joe looked at the fields, at the barns, at the house his father had worked and his grandfather had lived in after doing something that couldn't be undone but might, at this late hour, be partially answered for. "I want to do right by your grandfather, whatever that means for the property." He paused. "The farm is probably going to end up being yours. Legally, once the transfer is voided. I've known that since the records room." Ruby considered. "And your family? Your daughter? The kids?" "We'll figure it out. Melissa can work anywhere. The kids are young enough that a move doesn't set them back the way it would later." He said it steadily because he'd been preparing it, but it cost him something to say, which was appropriate. It was supposed to cost something. Loss wasn't supposed to feel like nothing, and he wasn't going to let himself believe otherwise just because the alternative was harder. "You've been farming this land your whole life," Ruby said. "Yes. You didn't steal it." "No, but I've been the one with my hands in the dirt for 40 years. That doesn't make it mine." Ruby was quiet for a while. The cold had come down from the ridge, and the porch light made a yellow circle against the dark. Somewhere in the field a night bird was working. "My grandfather wrote in his journal that he meant to leave this land to his children and his children's children," Ruby said, "so that they'd know the worth of it and the worth of the man who worked it." Joe waited. "I'm his children's children," Ruby said. "I'm the last of them." She looked at the farm, the barns and the fields and the house and the tree lines going dark against the sky. He built something worth having, and someone took it from him and buried him in his own field and told his family he'd walked away. She set down her coffee cup. "I want to know what's possible," she said. "Not what's easy. What's actually possible between two people who both have something at stake in this land. Your family for 80 years and mine for 30 years before that." She looked at Joe. "I'm not going to take something just because I can. That's not what my grandfather built this for." Joe looked at her. He thought about Luther Crane in 1938, starting a journal, setting down what he'd earned and what he'd built, trying to create something that would outlast his own ability to protect it. The man had understood something that Joe was only now catching up to, that the worth of land is not just what it produces, but what it represents to the people whose work and sacrifice went into it. Luther Crane had known that the farm wasn't just acres and soil. It was the record of what a man could build with nothing but time and care and the refusal to be stopped. "Then let's figure out what's possible," Joe said. The October night settled over the farm. The lights of the house made warm rectangles on the dark grass. Somewhere in the back 14 acres, the forensic marker stood in the turned earth above the hole where the chest had been, where Luther Crane had put his savings and his record and his bones and his belief that someone would eventually find it and understand. The investigation was far from over. The handwriting analysis hadn't returned its final verdict. The Ridgeline Holdings inquiry was running. The question of what would become of the land hadn't been answered. There were legal proceedings ahead that would take months and possibly years, hearings and motions, and the slow grinding work of trying to correct something that had been wrong for 8 decades. But on that porch, two people with no particular reason to trust each other had decided to try to find a third way. Not the easy way, not the adversarial way. The one that honored what Luther Crane had actually meant when he'd sealed that chest and set it in the ground. Not just the gold, not just the bones, but the intention behind all of it. The hard part was still coming. Neither of them was under any illusion about that. But sitting there in the dark with the farm quiet around them, the hard part felt for the first time like something two people might be able to go through together rather than against each other. And that was the difference between a problem and a possibility. Luther Crane had buried something in that field to protect it. 80 years later, two people who had every reason to be adversaries were sitting on a porch trying to figure out how to honor what he'd been protecting. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing he'd been counting on when he sealed the chest. Not a specific person, not a specific outcome, just the possibility that someday, when the iron came up out of the ground, there would be someone on the other side of it willing to do right. The forensic document examiner's report arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, 6 weeks after Joe had hit iron in the backfield. Dr. Raymond Foster had spent 31 years doing handwriting analysis for the federal courts and the FBI before retiring to private practice in Knoxville. And Morse had contracted him because his reputation for thoroughness was matched only by his reputation for being willing to stand behind his conclusions in a courtroom. The report ran to 43 pages, with 18 pages of comparative analysis, 12 pages of technical methodology, and 13 pages that translated the technical findings into plain English so that a judge and jury would not need a degree in forensic science to understand what the evidence said. The conclusion was on page 1. The signature attributed to Luther James Crane on the deed transfer document dated March 14th, 1943 was not written by the same individual who signed the 1940 water rights application or the 1941 tax payment receipt bearing Luther Crane's name. The pen pressure, letter formation, and stroke sequence were inconsistent across the three documents in ways that exceeded the natural variation expected from a single writer over time. The 1943 signature showed characteristics consistent with a practice forgery, meaning someone had studied the authentic signatures and attempted to replicate them, not someone writing naturally. With a confidence level of 94%, the signature on the deed transfer was fraudulent. The deed was forged. The transfer was void. Joe read the summary 3 times at the kitchen table, alone, the kids at school and Melissa at work, the morning light coming through the window at a low November angle. He'd known this was what the report would say since the morning in the records room, when he'd read the date on the 1943 transfer and then looked at the date of Luther Crane's last journal entry and understood what the gap of 1 day meant. Knowing something in your bones and having it confirmed in 43 pages of forensic analysis were different things, though. The confirmation had weight. It meant the story was no longer something that had happened in the past. It was something that was happening now, with documents and findings and legal implications that ran forward into the present. He called Ruby before he called Sims. She was already at her kitchen table when she picked up. She told him later, already waiting for the call, because Morse had called her first. "It's confirmed," Joe said. A pause. "Yes. What do you want to do? What we already said we'd do. Her voice was steady. We already knew. This just makes the paper say what the truth says. He called Sims next. Sims said the forgery finding, combined with the DNA confirmation and the journal evidence, gave them a complete chain. The title could be challenged and would succeed. The question now was how, not whether. Morse called Joe and Ruby within 10 minutes of each other. By noon, everyone was in the conference room again, the same table and the same chairs and the same institutional smell of the county building. But the atmosphere was different. The long uncertainty of the previous 6 weeks had resolved into something with edges and weight. A forgery meant the transfer had never legally occurred. 212 acres of Cannon County farmland had been the Crane family's land in 1943, and it was the Crane family's land now, because an unlawful act cannot create a lawful title regardless of how many subsequent years pass over it. Sims explained this to Joe in the parking lot afterward, standing between their 2 vehicles in the November cold. While inside, Archer was explaining the same thing to Ruby with presumably different emphasis. The 80 years of Harlan ownership creates a complication, Sims said. He'd told Joe this before, in general terms. Now, it was specific. There's a legal doctrine called adverse possession, which is essentially the idea that if you've occupied and farmed land openly for long enough without the legal owner objecting, you can establish a claim. The standard in Tennessee is 20 years of continuous, open, hostile possession. Joe looked at him. Hostile meaning what? Hostile in the legal sense means without permission from the true owner, not hostile in the ordinary sense. Sims paused. Your family farmed this land for 80 years, openly, paying taxes, making improvements. Under adverse possession doctrine, there's a colorable argument. What does colorable mean? It means someone can make the argument. It doesn't mean it wins. Sims met his eyes. If you wanted to fight the reversion of title, you'd have a basis to file. Most attorneys would take the case. It would go on for years and cost both sides considerably. Joe looked at the building where Ruby was. I'm not going to fight it. Sims nodded once. I know, but I needed you to know that you have options so that when you don't use them, you're choosing not to, not failing to. The acknowledgement mattered. Joe carried it back to the farm that afternoon and sat with it for an hour before Melissa came in from picking up the kids, and he told her what the report said and what Sims had told him about adverse possession and the choice he'd made. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. She'd been waiting for this, in the way you wait for something you've been expecting since the morning you saw your father's face in the driveway after the sheriff visit. She asked the same question Sims had asked him about what he wanted to do. We're not fighting it, Joe said. Melissa looked to the table. Not at him, at the table, the surface of the thing that had been the center of their household for 40 years. Ruth had cooked at this table. Melissa had done homework at it. Cody and Harper had made a mess of their dinners at it every week. Okay, she said. You're not going to push back? She looked up. You already know what's right. You've known since the records room. I'm not going to make you say it again. She looked at him steadily. We figure out what comes next. That's what we do. Joe thought about Ruth, about the particular clarity she'd had in hard situations, the ability to look at something squarely and accept it without needing it to be different from what it was. He'd thought for the past 2 years that he'd lost that quality when he lost her. Now he was looking at their daughter across the kitchen table and seeing it returned in a different form. I don't know what comes next exactly, Joe said, but I know we don't build anything real by keeping what isn't ours. Melissa folded her hands on the table. Grandpa Earl kept it. He did. And we're choosing not to. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. It was the nod of someone completing a decision, not beginning one. The decision had been made the morning the record room showed him the date, and everything since had been the slow work of accepting it. He called Ruby that evening and told her he wasn't going to contest the title reversion. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I know. Not I expected as much, or I hoped you'd say that. Just I know, as if it had already been settled between them in some understanding that didn't require more words. We need to talk about what happens next, Joe said. Yes. Can you come in Nashville this weekend? I have some people I want you to meet. I want to show you something I've been thinking about. Joe said he'd come. The Watkins situation resolved in its own way, separately from the main investigation, with the particular crumbling quality of things held together by silence for too long. Dale Watkins was 62 years old, a cattle farmer who'd inherited his great-uncle Philip's remaining properties, along with whatever unspoken understanding passed through that family about what certain entries in the county ledger represented. He hadn't been born when Philip Watkins forged Luther Crane's name in 1943. He hadn't chosen it, but he'd benefited from it in the form of parcels his family held adjacent to other disputed properties. And when Morse's inquiry into the broader pattern of 1943 land transfers began producing results, his attorney called first. Dale Watkins gave a voluntary statement in the second week of November, sitting in Morse's conference room with his attorney beside him and the particular heaviness of a man who'd been waiting for a knock on the door for longer than he'd admitted to himself. He said that Philip Watkins had told his son, Dale's grandfather, one time late in his life, that he'd made a mistake he couldn't fix, that he'd been pressured by Earl Harlan to certify a document he should have refused, that he'd been afraid of what Harlan would do if he didn't cooperate, and that he'd decided being afraid was worse than being complicit, and that he'd regretted the arithmetic of that decision for the rest of his life. The old man had called it a sin, not a crime, a sin, which was the older word for the same thing and carried its own weight. He hadn't named the victim, only the act. And he died without correcting it, the way most people die when they've done something they can't undo, still carrying it, still hoping somehow that time would accomplish what honesty couldn't. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't useful as evidence, being hearsay 3 generations removed. But it was a confession of sorts, a family finally releasing the thing it had been gripping without knowing it could let go. Dale Watkins also agreed to cooperate with the investigation into whether any of his inherited properties had similarly clouded titles. 2 of them did. Morse opened separate inquiries. Carson Webb withdrew from the picture in early December with the abrupt total retreat of someone who'd received very clear legal advice about what his continued involvement would cost him. His Nashville development firm issued no statement. His lawyers issued no statement. He simply stopped existing in relation to this matter, which was its own kind of answer about what he'd understood and when. Joe never met him and never expected to. Some people were part of the story, and some people were footnotes to it, and Webb had arranged himself as a footnote. Frank Steger closed his Woodbury office 2 weeks later. Joe heard about it from the hardware store owner on a Thursday morning while buying fence staples and found he had very little feeling about it. The office closing was something that had happened. It didn't require a response. The weekend trip to Nashville was the first time Joe had been to the city for something other than a medical appointment or a farm equipment supplier in several years. He drove the highway with the windows cracked in the November cold because the truck ran hot and he'd been meaning to get the thermostat looked at since September. The city rose up ahead of him in the afternoon light. The skyline he always found slightly unreal from the outside, too vertical for his sense of the world. Ruby lived on Woodland Street in East Nashville, in a brick house from a 1940s setback from the street behind a row of established oaks. The house was ordered and well-maintained, the yard raked, the porch furniture covered for winter. The kind of house that showed a person who respected their space without needing to perform it for anyone. She'd bought it in 1989. She'd mentioned to Melissa on the phone, when East Nashville was still affordable for a school principal and before the neighborhood became what it had become. She'd stayed because she didn't see the point of moving when you'd already found your place. Camille Archer was already there when Joe arrived, along with a property consultant named Harris from Archer's firm and Sims, who'd driven separately. They sat in Ruby's living room, which had bookcases on 3 walls and a photograph of Dorothy Sutton Washington on the mantel above the gas fireplace. A middle-aged woman looking directly at the camera with her mother's eyes, the same eyes Joe had seen reading a journal in a conference room 4 weeks ago. He looked at the photograph for a moment before sitting down. Ruby served coffee and then sat across from him with the directness that had characterized every interaction they'd had. She hadn't made small talk on the phone. She didn't make it now. There were things to be worked out, and she had prepared them. Ruby had a proposal. She'd had it drawn up by Archer's firm and the property consultant, and she'd clearly been thinking about it for longer than the past few weeks, because the document was specific and comprehensive in a way that suggested deliberate work rather than the kind of hasty proposal that gets written when someone is reacting rather than planning. She presented it without ceremony, setting the document on the coffee table and letting Joe and Sims take their time with it. It was 5 pages. Joe read it. Twice. Ruby was not asking Joe to leave the farm. The proposal transferred legal title of the 212 acres to Ruby Washington, correct and uncontested, as the rightful heir of Luther James Crane. That was non-negotiable, and they both knew it. But the remaining terms described a 50-year agricultural lease, renewable, at a rate structured to cover property taxes and a modest return on the land's value, while below market rate for comparable Tennessee farmland. Joe Harlan and his immediate family could remain in the farmhouse. He could farm the land as he'd always farmed it, pay the lease, maintain the property. The lease transferred to Melissa on his death if she wanted it. Additionally, and this was the part Joe read 3 times before he looked up, Ruby proposed that the coin collection, valued at a minimum of $2 million by Dr. Marsh's appraisal, be used in part to retire Joe's outstanding agricultural debt to First Consolidated Bank, listed in the proposal at its current amount, $340,000. The remaining amount, after debt retirement and legal fees, would be held in a trust in Ruby's name, to be used for purposes she outlined separately. Joe looked up. Ruby was watching him with the same measuring attention she'd had when she arrived at the farm 6 weeks ago, but the quality of it had changed. It wasn't assessment now. It was something closer to waiting. "You don't have to pay off my debt," Joe said. "I know I don't. Your grandfather's savings. That money should go to you. Your family. It is going to my family." Ruby held his gaze. "What my grandfather built was stolen from his children. My mother grew up without him and without this land and without the future he was trying to give her. That can't be undone." She paused. "But you did the right thing. You found the chest, and you called me instead of trying to make it disappear, and you cooperated with an investigation that cost you enormously and might have cost you more. That matters. It shouldn't have taken 80 years. No, it shouldn't." Ruby's voice was level. "But it took what it took, and here we are. My grandfather tried to protect his children. I can protect his memory better by doing something useful with what he left than by using it as a weapon against a man who didn't steal from him." She looked at the proposal on the coffee table, at the numbers and clauses, and the 50-year lease term. "My grandfather saved that gold for 30 years because he understood that the only security worth having was what you built yourself and protected yourself. He buried it because he couldn't trust the systems other people controlled. He was right about that." She paused. "But he was also trying to give his children something real, something that would mean a future was possible." She looked at Joe. "That's what I'm trying to do. Something that actually produces what he intended." Joe looked at the document in his hands. $340,000. The weight he'd been carrying since the winter after Ruth died, the number that had made every morning feel like the start of a reckoning he couldn't win. He thought about the morning he'd driven the tractor into the backfield, desperate enough to break a warning he'd carried his whole life. Luther Crane had put his savings in the ground to protect his children's future. And now, 80 years later, those savings were going to secure the future of a family that had unknowingly been living on what was taken from him. Joe set the document down. He looked at Ruby. "What's the trust for?" She reached into the folder beside her and produced another document, 2 pages. "A scholarship fund for students from Cannon County, first-generation college students specifically, named for my grandfather." She sat on the coffee table. He wanted to leave something to his children's children so they'd know the worth of what he'd built. "I don't have children, but there are plenty of other people's children who could use what he left." The room was quiet. Outside, the oaks on Woodland Street moved in the winter wind. Sims asked several practical questions about the lease structure and the debt retirement mechanism, and Archer answered them with the efficiency of someone who'd anticipated each one. Harris explained the property valuation methodology. The meeting lasted 2 hours and was, for the most part, orderly and professional and contained, the way important things sometimes get done when the people involved have decided what they want and are doing the work of making it real. Joe signed the lease agreement that afternoon. His signature looked ordinary on the page, just letters, just a name. But the weight of what it represented settled over the following few days in pieces, as the reality of what had been decided reached him gradually rather than all at once. He was keeping the farm, not as owner, not in the way he'd imagined keeping it, but as the person whose hands were in the dirt and whose family lived in the house, which was the way he'd always experienced ownership anyway. The land had never felt like a possession. It had felt like a responsibility. That part hadn't changed. He told Melissa on the drive home, walking her through the terms as they came back through Nashville on the interstate. She listened without interrupting, which was her way with information she was processing in real time. When he finished, the car was quiet for a while, the highway moving under them. "The debt is gone," she said. "Yes." Another silence. "We stay in the house." "Yes." "Long-term lease. 50 years." She didn't have to do any of that. Melissa wasn't questioning it. She was sitting with the fact of it, the specific quality of what Ruby had chosen to do when she could have chosen otherwise. "No," Joe said. "She didn't. What do we owe her?" He thought about the question. It deserved more than a quick answer. "I think we owe her honesty and the work," he said eventually. "Farming the land the way her grandfather farmed it. Keeping it producing. Not wasting what he built." He looked at the highway ahead, and keeping his name in front of people. The scholarship fund, the story. Making sure it doesn't just fade back into the county records. Melissa nodded. "I can do that." They drove the rest of the way home in a comfortable quiet, the kind that happens between people who have said the important things and don't need to fill the space after them. The First Consolidated Bank sent a formal confirmation of debt retirement in January, a letter on bank letterhead that managed to sound both professional and slightly resentful. The tone of an institution that had been counting on a foreclosure and had been denied it by events it didn't fully control. Joe read the letter once, set it on the kitchen table, and did not read it again. The number that had been the shape of his fear for 3 years was now a 0, and zeros didn't require rereading. Luther Crane's burial happened on a Saturday in December, 2 weeks after the Nashville meeting. The state lab released the remains following completion of forensic analysis, and Ruby had arranged a plot in the Woodbury Municipal Cemetery, in a section that looked out over the eastern hills, the same direction as the farm. The headstone was simple. Luther James Crane, 1901 to 1943, and below that a line Ruby had chosen from the journal's first page. He set down what he earned and what he built so that those who came after would know its worth. The morning of the burial, Joe woke at 5 and lay in the dark for a while before getting up. He thought about what a burial was supposed to do, what it completed. He thought about Luther Crane in the iron chest in the back field, in the cold and the dark under 18 inches of clay for 80 Decembers. He thought about the journal in the chest, the careful handwriting going on in the dark, waiting. He got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window in the pre-dawn, watching the back field until the light came. The ceremony was small. Ruby had not wanted it large. The people who came were the people who had earned the right to be there. Joe and Melissa, Cody and Harper, who stood quietly the way children stand at solemn occasions when they understand that something important is happening even if they can't name it precisely. Sheriff Pruitt, who had come in civilian clothes rather than uniform, a deliberate choice that Joe appreciated. Agent Morse, who had driven down from Nashville on her own time without being asked. Gerald Sims, Camille Archer, Jim Bolin, a local historian who had spent 20 years documenting land records from the 1940s in Cannon County and who wept openly and without embarrassment throughout. The tears of a man who'd suspected for years what the records hinted at and was now standing in front of the confirmation. And Margaret Sullivan, 81 years old, who had known Luther Crane as a neighbor in the years before 1943 and who arrived with her daughter and a bunch of dried wildflowers from her garden that she'd kept in a vase all winter specifically for this morning. She placed them at the grave without ceremony and stood very straight, the posture of a woman who had been carrying something for 8 decades and was setting it down in the only place it could be set. A minister named Reverend Tate spoke briefly. She had not known Luther Crane, but Ruby had given her the journal to read, and she quoted from it twice from an entry in 1940 where he wrote about planting corn with his daughter Dorothy, about the particular satisfaction of work that produced something real, about the way that satisfaction was connected to the land and the land was connected to his father before him and to the children he hoped would come after. She said that a man whose record survives him is not entirely gone, and that the people gathered here were proof of it, because they had been drawn to this place by a voice written down in 1940 and preserved in iron for 80 years. When Reverend Tate finished, there was a silence that nobody tried to fill. The December morning held them all in it, the cold air and the pale sky and the hills to the east with the bare trees running along their ridgelines. Somewhere across those hills, the backfield sat in the winter light, the disturbed earth of the cleared 6 acres and the still fallow 8 that Joe planned to break in spring. The same earth Luther Crane had turned with his own equipment 90 years ago. Cody stood beside Joe through most of the service, and at the end, when people were beginning to move away from the graveside, he tugged Joe's sleeve. Did he know we'd find it? Joe thought about it honestly. He hoped someone would. Cody looked at the headstone. We found it. You found it. Your mother found the records. You were part of this. Cody considered this with the specific gravity of an 8-year-old absorbing information he intends to keep. Then he nodded once and went to find his sister, who had gotten tired of standing still and was examining the frost patterns on a nearby stone. After the others left, Joe and Ruby stood at the grave for a few minutes without speaking. The December air was cold and clear, the kind of winter day that was painful in a clean way, light without warmth, the sky a pale blue that didn't apologize for anything. Do you feel like it's finished? Joe asked. Ruby considered. No, I don't think things like this finish. She looked at the headstone. But this part is done. He's in the ground properly. His name is on a stone. People know what happened to him. She pulled her coat tighter. That's not nothing. It wasn't nothing. Joe had been thinking about what it was for several weeks, trying to find a word for the specific thing that had happened over the past 2 months. Not justice exactly. Justice implied proportion, a response that matched the offense. And there was no response proportional to a man being murdered and buried in his own field and his family being told he'd abandoned them. Not closure, which was a word that implied things ending when they didn't, not really. What had happened was more like correction. A record that had been wrong for 80 years had been made right. Not everything, not all of it, but the thing that could be corrected had been corrected. My mother used to say that the worst thing about injustice wasn't the thing that was taken, Ruby said, looking at her grandfather's headstone. It was the silence after, the way the story changed to fit what the powerful people needed it to say. She paused. She didn't know she was talking about him, but she was. Joe thought about Ida Crane raising 2 children in the silence of a story that wasn't true. About Dorothy growing up believing her father had left. About Ruby carrying that as a fact about the world and passing it down without knowing what it actually was. The silence is over, Joe said. Ruby looked at him. For this family, yes. For a lot of others, it isn't yet. She looked back at the headstone. That's what the scholarship is for. What Boland's research is for. What Morse's investigation is for. Making sure the silence keeps getting broken in the places where it's still holding. She stood a while longer at the grave, and Joe stood beside her, and the December light moved across the hill country and the bare trees and the stone with Luther Crane's name on it, and after a while they walked back together to where the cars were parked and the day's other work was waiting. The story broke publicly in the 3rd week of December. Jim Boland had been in contact with a journalist of the Nashville Tennessean named Patricia Wynn who covered civil rights history and property law, and Wynn had been working on the piece for 3 weeks by the time it published, with access to the court documents, the forensic reports, and interviews with Joe, Ruby, Morse, Pruitt, and Margaret Sullivan. Ruby had reviewed the piece before publication and approved it. Joe had done the same. The headline ran above the fold on a Sunday. A farmer, a locked chest, and the 80-year secret of the backfield. Wynn had written it carefully, without the exaggeration that a story like this could attract, letting the facts carry what they needed to without amplification. She'd made a specific choice that Joe appreciated. She let Luther Crane's journal entries speak in the story rather than just describing them. Quoting several passages from the 1942 and 1943 sections, the entries that documented the increasing pressure from Earl Harlan, in Luther's own words, his refusal to sign, the men who came to his door, the trip to Nashville he never made. The effect was to make Luther Crane a person rather than a case. A man writing in real time about things happening to him, with no knowledge that someone would read it 80 years later. The piece ran 4,000 words. It was shared widely, first across Tennessee and then nationally, picked up by papers in Atlanta and Chicago and Washington. The Associated Press ran a shorter version. Several national radio programs covered it. A documentary filmmaker from New York called Archer's office within a week of publication asking about rights. Not all the response was warm. A letter to the editor in the Murfreesboro paper argued that the deal Ruby had reached with Joe was too lenient, that she should have pursued full restitution and left the Harlans to find their own housing arrangements. Another letter from a different reader argued that Ruby had no right to the land at all, that 80 years of Harlan possession settled the question regardless of how the possession began, and that dredging up old crimes only created new injustices. Joe read both letters once. He didn't respond to either because he'd said what he had to say in the interview he'd given, and adding more wouldn't change the minds that were already made up. What was harder to dismiss was a letter he received by mail from a woman in Memphis whose grandmother had owned a farm adjacent to one of the other disputed properties Morse was investigating. The woman had grown up hearing her grandmother talk about land she'd once had, land that had been taken, land she couldn't get back. She'd assumed it was grief speaking, the kind of story that grows in the telling over generations until it bears little resemblance to what actually happened. Now she wasn't sure. She wrote to Joe not asking for anything, just saying that his story had made her look more carefully at her own family's history, and that she wasn't sure yet what she'd find. Joe wrote back. He told her about Morse and about Bolin and about the county records and where to start looking. He told her that the records were there, that they didn't always say what people had been told they said, and that finding out the truth was worth the difficulty even when the truth was painful. He meant it. He'd learned that from a man he'd never met, who'd written it down in 1938 and sealed it in iron in the ground. Ruby agreed to 2 national interviews. An NPR conversation that aired on a Thursday morning, which Joe heard on the truck radio driving back from a livestock auction, Ruby's voice coming through the cab speakers with the steadiness of someone who'd thought carefully about what she wanted to say and said it. The host asked her how she felt now that everything had been resolved. Ruby said she wasn't sure resolved was the right word. She said that what had happened was that a wrong had been acknowledged and a record corrected, and those were important things, but they were different from resolution in the sense of completion, because there was no completion available for her mother dying without knowing the truth about her father. The host paused and said that was a very honest answer. Ruby said it was the only kind worth giving. Joe gave one interview himself to a reporter from the Murfreesboro Daily News Journal who drove out to the farm on a cold January morning and sat at the kitchen table and asked straightforward questions. Joe answered straightforwardly. He said he'd found the chest while clearing a field he should have cleared 30 years ago. He said he'd called 911 because there were human bones and it was the right thing to do. He said he wasn't a hero for doing the right thing and he'd prefer people didn't describe him as one. The reporter published the interview nearly verbatim, with a photograph of Joe standing in the back field near the spot where the chest had been, the turned earth stretching toward the tree line behind him. His expression in the photograph, Melissa said, was the expression of a man who'd been through something. He supposed that was accurate. The Luther Crane Scholarship Fund was established in January, administered through the Cannon County Community Foundation with Ruby as the founding trustee. The initial endowment, after the debt retirement and legal fees and the cost of the burial and the headstone, was $1.4 million. The first scholarships would go out in the spring, 4 of them first-generation college student from Cannon County, $2,000 each, renewable for years. Small, relative to the endowment. Intended to grow. Ruby came back to Woodbury for the scholarship announcement. She stood at a podium in the high school gymnasium and told Luther Crane's story to 200 people, most of whom had read about it in the paper, but who heard it differently when the woman telling it was his granddaughter. She read one passage from the journal, the 1940 entry about planting corn with Dorothy, and the gymnasium was quiet in the way that large groups go quiet when everyone is paying attention to the same thing at the same moment. Afterward, She shook hands with each of the 4 scholarship recipients, 2 girls and 2 boys, all 18 or 19, and looked at each of them for a moment before she spoke. "He would have been glad to meet you," she told them. He believed in the next generation. He believed in exactly this. Joe stood at the back of the gymnasium and watched. He thought about Earl Harlan dead in 1967 and what he would have made of standing in this room on this day. Luther Crane's name on a plaque on the gymnasium wall. Jim Boland gave a presentation at the county library in February about the broader pattern of land transfers Morse's investigation had uncovered, 7 other parcels that had changed hands under suspicious circumstances in the same period in 1943 and 1944. 3 cases were still active investigations. 4 others had been settled, 2 with property returning to heirs, 2 with financial settlements where reversal proved impossible. The presentation drew more people than the room could hold and had to be moved to the high school auditorium, a fact that seemed to genuinely surprise Boland, who had spent 20 years collecting this information for a small audience and hadn't expected the wider world to find it urgent. Joe attended. He sat in the 3rd row with Ruby on one side and Melissa on the other. When Boland put up a map of the county with the disputed parcels marked, he could see his own farm's outline in the northeast quadrant, bordered by the fields he'd worked for 40 years. One of many places. One of the ones that had been found. It was not history in the sense of being over. It was present in every title, every deed, every tract of land that had passed from one family to another under pressure that couldn't be proven at the time. He drove home from the presentation through the dark of a February night with the radio off. The farm came up on his right, the barns first, and then the house, and he turned into the drive with the familiarity of a man who'd made this turn 10,000 times. He sat in the truck for a moment before going in. February. For months since the tractor bucket hit iron at 18 inches. For months from desperate to something else, something that didn't have a clean name, but that felt, on this February night, like it might be the right shape for the rest of his life. The debt was gone. That fact was still new enough that he noticed it each morning, the absence of a weight he'd been carrying for 3 years. The farm was no longer his in the technical legal sense, but it was where he lived and worked and would continue to live and work, and the distinction between ownership and stewardship had narrowed considerably in his thinking over the past 4 months. He'd been a steward all along, really. The land had been here before his grandfather and would be here after Cody's children. What you did with it during your time was the only question that mattered. He had 50 years on the lease. More, if Melissa wanted it after him. Cody was 8 years old. By the time Cody was grown, the scholarship fund would have sent dozens of Cannon County kids to college. Luther Crane's name would be on something that produced real results every single year, something that didn't need maintenance or explanation or anyone's continued attention to keep working. The man who'd been buried in a field and told to stay there would instead be the reason a kid from Woodbury became the first in her family to get a degree. That was worth finding. That was worth the tractor and the bolt cutters and the 911 call and everything that had followed. Ruby had called him the week before from Nashville, a Sunday evening call that wasn't about business. They'd talked for 40 minutes about her mother, about the early photographs of Dorothy she'd found in a box she hadn't opened in 20 years, about what it meant to know someone better after they were gone than you'd known them when they were alive. Joe had told her about Ruth, about the 14 months, about the particular silence of a house after a person who'd organized it around themselves was gone. They talked the way people talk when they've been through something together and come out the other side, and found that the other side contains unexpected companionship. Ruby said she was planning to come back to Woodbury in the spring when the weather was better, and she'd like to see the backfield planted. Joe said she was welcome whenever she wanted to come. Inside, Melissa had dinner going, and the kids were loud and alive and entirely indifferent to the weight of historical events, which was exactly right. Harper had recently decided she was interested in rocks, a development sparked by visiting the field site twice and asking so many questions about soil composition that Melissa had bought her a geology primer from the school book fair. Cody had started reading about Tennessee history on his own initiative, an interest his teacher said had begun in the fall and which she found entirely encouraging. Joe hung his coat and washed his hands at the kitchen sink and looked out at the back field in the February dark. You couldn't see the excavation site from here in winter, the tree line too close and the light wrong, but he knew exactly where it was. He'd know where it was for the rest of his life. He thought about Luther Crane on a September morning in 1943, setting the iron chest into that ground, packing the earth carefully, knowing what was coming and doing the only thing still available to him. He thought about the journal inside the chest, 147 pages of careful writing, and the man who'd spent 5 years setting down what he'd earned and what he'd built so that the people who came after would know its worth. They knew now. That was the thing Luther Crane had been trying to make permanent. Not the gold, not the land, but the knowledge. The record. The proof that a man had been there, had built something, had loved his children enough to try to protect them even when he couldn't protect himself. The iron had held. The record had survived. And what Luther Crane had planted in that ground had grown into something he couldn't have planned but might have hoped for. A reckoning and a correction. A name on a headstone. For kids with scholarship letters. 2 families who had sat across from each other with every reason to be adversaries and found a third way instead. A woman in Memphis who was going to the county records to look at her grandmother's story more carefully. 7 other investigations running in parallel, other fields with other chests, other records of other lives that had been erased and might still be found. It wasn't justice, not entirely. It never could be, not for what had been taken. But it was true, and it was real, and it would outlast the people in this room by decades. And that was the kind of permanence Luther Crane had understood from the beginning, the kind you build not for yourself, but for the people who come after, the kind that holds an iron in the ground even when everything else has been stripped away. Joe turned from the window. Dinner was almost ready. The kids were arguing cheerfully about something inconsequential. Melissa caught his eye over their heads and smiled. Joe sat down at the table. Ruby came back in late April, on a Thursday when the back 14 were ready to plant. She drove up from Nashville in the morning and arrived midday, and Joe met her in the driveway the way he'd met her the first time, standing by the house with his hands in his coat pockets. But the meeting was different now. The measuring quality was gone. She'd been here enough times over the winter that the farm had stopped being a foreign place for her and started being what it was, her grandfather's land, now properly acknowledged as such, farmed by a man who understood what that meant. They walked the back field together. The ground had been turned and harrowed and was ready, the dark soil loose and receptive, smelling of the particular combination of minerals and organic matter that good agricultural land produces in spring. Joe had planted the cleared 6 acres the week before, corn in long rows that would be knee-high by July. The new 8 acres, the ones he'd never touched, were going in today. Ruby walked the rows slowly. She looked at the soil the way Joe had seen her look at the journal in the conference room, with the attention of someone trying to absorb something real. She knelt at one point and pressed her palm flat against the earth. "He walked this ground," she said. "Yes." She stood up, looked at the field stretching to the tree line. He counted this in what he was building, this specific soil. "It's good land," Joe said. "It was good then. It's still good." Ruby looked at him. Something in her expression settled into a kind of peace that Joe hadn't seen in her face before. Not the peace of everything being resolved, because it wasn't, but the peace of someone who has put down something she'd been carrying for a long time and found the ground solid under her feet. "Plant it," she said. Joe climbed up on the tractor. Ruby stood at the edge of the field and watched. The engine turned over and settled into its working idle, and Joe lined up on the first row and moved down into the soil, and the back 14 acres that had been fallow since 1943 sealed off with a story about a mule and the weight of what was buried underneath, finally opened up and received what it had been waiting for. The farm was quiet around them, the February dark holding the fields in the cold that came before spring, before the ground opened again and the work started over. In a few months, he'd be back in the cleared acres with the tractor. The back 14 were good soil, dark and dense and rested. Exactly the kind of ground that rewarded the first planting. Luther Crane had farmed this same ground 90 years ago, had felt this soil turning under similar equipment, had sat at the end of a long day with the tiredness that comes from work that matters, and had believed that the land he was building would outlast him and his children. He'd been right about that. It had just taken longer than he expected, and come back through a door he hadn't known to look for. And it had come back to people he couldn't have anticipated, a farmer who was drowning and a granddaughter he'd never met, who between them had decided that the right thing and the possible thing were close enough to the same thing to be worth doing. That was the other thing Luther Crane had planted in the ground without knowing it. Not just the evidence, not just the goal, but the possibility. The possibility that when the chest finally opened and the record finally surfaced, whoever was standing on either side of it might choose to do something with it that he would have recognized as decent. That they might look at what he'd built and what had been taken from him and decide that some things were worth more than the easier path. He hadn't been able to guarantee that. Nobody could. He'd done what he could with the time he had and sealed the rest in iron and trusted the earth to hold it until the right moment. The earth had held. The moment had come. The people in it had done what he'd hoped. Not because they were exceptional, not because the story demanded a certain kind of ending, but because, given a clear choice between right and wrong, they'd chosen right. That was enough. That was, in the end, what all of it had been reaching toward. Not vindication, not triumph. Just a choice made clearly in the full knowledge of what it cost. The tractor moved down the row. The soil opened and received the seed. The spring light came level across the hill country, the same light that had come across it every spring for as long as the hills had been hills. And what had been buried came finally, fully, all the way up into the living world. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.